Okay, we're going to give the panelists a few minutes to respond to the respective interpretations, maybe limited to 5 minutes so that we can get to some questions. Doug?
Oh, I'm sorry, I really have nothing.
Okay, sure. Radhika, you want to respond to?
Okay, sure. Well, I'll just take the points in the order in which I've listed them because I think it's a chance to order them. On the point about high levels of mass consumption through borrowing, actually I've been asking this question to several people. I don't have the capacity to create my own answer, but I do want to put it out there. There's a very interesting question as to where exactly how much of the increased borrowing in the last decade actually went to the working classes and how much actually simply went to people who are already quite rich. I think this is something that people assume that wages will be replaced by credit, and I mean I'm not saying that, I mean I assumed this at one point as well, but I think this is an interesting empirical question I'd just like to throw out there. The neoliberal era seems to have, yes, I think that this is a very interesting point as well, and I agree with the point that, you know, especially in the United States, and possibly in most Western countries anyway, the crisis seems to have not dislodged the ruling classes, by which I mean not just the capitalist classes, but in particular the financial capitalist classes, although it is an open question whether the distinction can any longer be made, but I'll make that a rather esoteric point and leave that aside for the moment. So I think that it's definitely the case that they are in power. But the real question is, even if they get every last thing they want, will it work? What they want is so contradictory. Yesterday they were too big to fail. Today they are already too big to bail out. Okay, so and they are, and in fact and here also there is a very big differences. As I said, this is not a single crisis, and the same things are not happening everywhere. So it's very important to disaggregate and see how the pieces fit together in a very complex system. So the US financial classes have been handsomely bailed out, not just by the piddly little TARP, which was what, 700 billion, but actually by quantitative easing, through which the Fed has taken all their toxic assets and put them on its own balance sheet and continues to give them more capital. So fine. And I mean, and we can discuss QE as well. I mean, I'm given 10 minutes, so I don't want to spend too much time. But the point is that they have got everything they wanted, but they still can't get their way. They cannot recreate the sort of financialization on which their prosperity days before 2007, 2008 relied. So I don't think one can assume that their political power is forever. So the party of austerity is winning, but again, here's another problem with that. And that is that the very austerity which the bondholders are imposing on various governments is going to ensure that they cannot be paid back. So this is a very interesting contradiction. Again, we need to talk about that, etc. Yes. One of the I don't want to take too much time doing that. I certainly, and all of these things to me are indicators that capital is not doing fine. I think those of us, or the idea that they are doing fine is profoundly problematic, and I think that it weakens any potential movement that may emerge. Very quickly on the other points that were raised by Leo. Inter-imperialist rivalry, back then it was a mixture. I mean, I didn't quite understand whether you meant that inter-imperialist rivalry was a mixture of feudal and capitalist states, that is, states that were a mixture of feudal and capitalist, or you were merely indicating that at that time there were in existence pre-capitalist empires. The latter is also true, but I just like the clarification. Hobson actually clearly saw the possibility of deepening accumulation, and he mentioned this, and I quote him in my book to this effect. Kautsky was right, Lenin was wrong. Actually, Kautsky and Lenin were looking at the same things, and Lenin, in fact, at one point insisted, for very profoundly political reason, as indeed a political leader should, that monopoly stage of capitalism leads inevitably to war, etc., etc. But at another point, he came to agree with Kautsky. Again, I talk about this in my book. Crisis of the 1970s did not lead to imperialist rivalry. Well, there weren't any colonies to be had. Already, states were sufficiently powerful at least to defend themselves. If you look at the record of US imperialism, it did not exactly win in Korea. It lost in Vietnam. It has lost in Afghanistan and Iraq. Sure, it walked over Grenada. Wonderful, powerful US imperialism. the differences between the core capitalist powers in the 1970s, Mandel was not alone in seeing the possibility of a major fracturing of the various capitalist powers into relatively separate realms. And I think that that era would need to be revisited. The fact that, and nor do I think that since that time was there any kind of suturing of those fractures. I think the fractures continue to remain, they continue to this day. That's what makes this crisis not a single crisis. These economies are much, even though the US, the Atlantic axis, so to speak, represents the greatest integration, this integration is considerably less than we imagine. Very, very important points. If finance, this vast increase in finance is so functional to production and, as Leo would have it, to global production, what explains the great bubbles that have laid the US economy prostrate at this time? There were enormous bubbles that had nothing to do with production at all. And finally, we talk about the strength of the US dollar and the Chinese keeping their reserves, etc. There are some very interesting statistics that I again cite in my book, and I can supply the papers as necessary. When you talk about the strength of the US dollar and refer to the Chinese buying bonds and so on, US treasuries and so on, you completely forget the Chinese hold only 7% or so of the total amount of US treasuries, and that's not inconsiderable. I'm not saying that is inconsiderable for one country to hold that much, but it is only 7%. If you look at the actual capital flows in the, what's the word for it, in the 2000s, under the housing bubble in particular, what you find is that if you disaggregate them as to, first of all you have to look at gross flows, that is to say not just the net flows, because the net flows seem to point to China, but gross flows really show that the only part of the world that was, or the part of the world that was most invested in the US housing bubble was Europe, and the hit that Europe has taken or took after the bubble burst in 2008 formed the foundation of the Euro crisis that followed. The Chinese did not suffer as much, the Indians did not suffer as much, etc. One final point, since you mentioned in the, listen, not only do I not think that in the Indian rupee is anywhere close to being a world currency, nor do I think it should be. More to the point, this habit, and this is a very key point, one of the things I argue in my book is that the very idea that the history of world capitalism can be conceived of as a succession of hegemonies was born in order to legitimize US actions as benign, not even in a time when, according to this theory, the US was allegedly hegemonic, but after that period had already ended. This so-called, Kindleberger writes his book in 1973, the world systems folks pick up that ball and run with it and give it all the weight of their great erudition only in the 1970s. What kind of theory is that? The point, what I'm trying to say is that this idea, it is entirely manufactured for the purposes of US power. In reality, as I argue in my book, UK dominance was inevitable, and it was also unrepeatable. And so the US attempts to make the US the world's money was bound to fail. Any national money trying to serve as world money comes up against a series of problems which can only be resolved at great cost both to the domestic and the rest of the world's economies. And so my point here, and Keynes knew this, and this is very interesting, and I've just been writing a paper on how actually Keynes came to arrive at this idea of Bancor and the International Clearing Union, a super sovereign currency that will be the currency of no country. Why did he even think about it? Because remember, he began thinking about these issues in 1913 was his first major publication, which is basically a sort of a paean, a sort of great praise for the operation of the gold standard. How did he get from there to wanting to write gold completely out of the world system and not allowing any country's currency, least of all sterling, not dollar, etc., to be the world's money? This was the force of circumstances. Those circumstances have only grown more insistent in our time. This cannot happen. And in China, people assume that the Chinese want to internationalize the renminbi. No, there is actually a struggle taking place in China as to whether the renminbi should be internationalized or not. One side definitely does not think so. I do hope for the welfare of the world and the Chinese people, they don't win.
Actually, now I have a couple of points that I think. First of all, just a minor point, the Federal Reserve has actually sold many, perhaps most of the toxic assets acquired during the crisis at a profit. And they perform the role of what Wall Street calls a strong buyer or the smart money. In the midst of a panic, they bought up undervalued assets and have sold them into the recovery very successfully. The cost of the treasury of the TARP now has become minimal because they've managed to recover most of those assets as well. So I think there's a little bit of AIG money perhaps still left out, but they've actually more or less made money on the bailout. So one point. Yes, capitalist power is perhaps not forever. Maybe only a diamond is forever. But they're doing well now. I mean, really to say that capitalism, the capitalist class is not profiting right now, to say that they're not rolling in money and enjoying a great deal of political power, just strikes me as I feel like I've walked through a looking glass when I hear that. They are really quite dominating discourse and policy, and there's no credible threat to that power on the landscape that I can see right now. I don't know. And nothing, it could change. God knows, anything can happen, anything can change, but right now, they really look like they're riding high. And just to hear the American empire described as something less than successful, just also feels like the other side of the looking glass. I mean, it's been just a remarkably powerful, successful, transformative enterprise for decades and decades. It may be fraying around the edges right now, but it still has a lot of power left to it. And then the Chinese share of treasury bond buying, the stock of Chinese holdings of treasuries might be only 7%. I can't remember the exact number myself right now. But there are very many crucial years in which they bought a very large share of the new issues. So the flows, they had a very large share of the flows, even if they didn't acquire an enormous amount of the stock. They pull back now. The Federal Reserve became a larger buyer. American households have become larger buyers. But the Chinese were very, very crucial at points. And other foreign central banks too. The holdings of reserves that other foreign central banks had and then invested in the treasury market that's enormous in the trillions. And even by the standards of the U.S. economy, trillions is a large number. And bubbles have a lot to do with productive activity. They generally arise late in a boom, but they're often based on something really fundamental. The bubble of the 1920s was based on a total revolution in production, development of consumer credit, the invention of radio, the invention of the automobile, the first stages of suburbanization. Certainly it ended in a bubble that then crashed and left us a long depression, but that was really about something. There were bubbles in, even the dot-com bubble was about something. The housing bubble wasn't about much of anything, but to say that bubbles have nothing to do with productive enterprises, I think is wrong. And then finally, the issue of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This is a term that we've been through this before, the Historical Materialism Conference, but I'll rephrase it. This is a term invented by a Goldman Sachs guy, Jim McNeil, as a marketing device. And as a way to sell securities and to sell concepts. There is no way that is a coherent entity in any meaningful sense. Brazil and China feud constantly over industrial rivalries. Brazil's boom has been very heavily a commodity-driven export boom. Russia is nothing, little more than an oil exporter with perhaps dwindling oil. India is important, but it's certainly not China. And South Africa is just sort of tacked on as an afterthought. It really has, it's next to the other countries, it's pretty small and pretty insignificant in the global economy. So I don't see that they are in any sense a meaningful alternative to the U.S. economy. And China and the United States are kind of very mutually dependent on each other. They have a pretty good thing going, and I think both sides have a stake in keeping that going. There are not many meaningful sense rivals. Maybe 10, 20, 30 years from now, yes, but not in the present.
Just very, very quickly, I don't think there's any disagreement amongst any of us from what I've heard, that this isn't a very severe crisis and that they can't find an easy way out of it. and that has much to do with whatever restrictions on credit are imposed either by the banks themselves or by austerity policies of governments. And austerity policies of governments, of course, have to do with fears of bond markets and what bond markets will do to them if they don't do this. And the bond markets reflect the reinforced power of financial capital. But let's remember that it's Caterpillar and the German industrial exporters who are the largest opponents, the most vocal opponents of the regulation of derivatives and the introduction of a total tax, because it's costly to them, given their dependence on these things. But I think something, we have to be more self-reflective, and I think what's happening here is very rich and important. There's been a strong, rich tradition in Marxist theory, quite rightly, that against neoclassical economics, indeed against classical economics, Marxists understand that this is a contradiction with system capitalism, and that it's crisis-prone. And a great many Marxists, whether they've been academic economists or whether they've been party leaders, have run that side of Marxism. They're trying to show, and they're usually right, that this is a crisis-prone system. The question is whether one understands the spread and deepening of capitalism over the last century and a half and more in terms of the final crisis only having been postponed. Well, maybe it was only postponed. But if in the process of being postponed, it changes all social relations into capitalist social relations, if in the process of being postponed, it takes us through the second, third, and fourth industrial revolution, if in the crisis of being postponed, most working people are now integrated into capitalist finance in a way that Marx never could have understood in terms of their dependence on it, okay? Then we need to stop for a minute and say, after all, capitalists don't think in terms of what's it going to look like 3 centuries from now. They think if I can make my billion in the next 5 years, let the rest of the world go to hell. That's how the system operates.
5 years is long term.
5 years. So we have to think more dialectic. Of course it's a crisis-prone system. One doesn't have to have a falling rate of profit theory to see that. It's crisis-prone by virtue of the chaos of the market and there being no hidden hand. Of course. But we have to understand dialectically that it's also, as it's crisis-prone, also incredibly dynamic. In fact, it's so crisis-prone because it's so fucking dynamic.
And many capitalists agree with that, I think.
And of course, it's our job to be able to say there are going to be crises here. Those assholes who extrapolate trends, right, need to be laughed at and exposed, obviously. But we also need to understand that the struggle to succeed capitalism isn't answered by your ability to predict crises. I want to find the Marxist economist who's good at predicting prices, who also can tell us how to get to socialism out of it.
Okay, I know we could probably keep going back and forth here all day. We want to open up to some questions as well, and I'm sure we'll address some more questions. Yeah, we'll go there. We'll take a couple questions at a time and try to keep them brief and make sure that there are questions. So back there, actually.
I just want to address, Mr. Tsai, I don't know if I misunderstood you. You were questioning the amount of debt of the 99, or what might be called the 99%. I want to point out that there have been 4 million foreclosures, the subprime market. People's inability to make their mortgage payments came about because the rate of productivity did not match what the wage the laborers were bringing home, and they eventually were not able to make their mortgage payments. So the debt for is about over $1 trillion for student debt in order to pay for education, and the credit card. In order just to make ends meet, these workers needed to borrow. So I think I would say that the debt.
Sorry, can I just quickly?
Sure.
Because it's a non-issue. I completely agree with what you're saying. My point was really that yes, this is very important. 4 million foreclosures is an enormous amount of human suffering. Okay, I completely agree with that. What I'm saying is, in the larger scheme of things, I want to know what proportion this was actual debt contracted by working people in comparison to middle class people and others. Because I suspect that although people basically say, oh, you didn't earn enough, you took debt. Actually, it's a defense of the working class and saying that actually the banks, although they claim to give credit to the working class, did not give most of the credit to the working class at all. The credit balloon may very well have been caused by the excess consumption of the already well-to-do. That's what I'm trying to say.
The working class did get a tremendous amount.
I agree. My question was really very specific. How much? What was the proportion? That was my question.
Okay, we're here.
I'm wondering how you fit the environmental crisis into these questions. It seems maybe the crisis that's...
And take Alan as well.
I have a little bit of trouble reconciling Doug's
Speak up a little
statement.
bit.
A little bit of trouble reconciling Doug's statement that there is really no problem with the current situation, with Leo immediately after that saying,
I didn't say anything resembling that, no.
okay, well, I have trouble, we'll see the record. I have trouble reconciling that with Leo's statement that there is no disagreement amongst the presenters.
I didn't think Doug said there was no trouble. He said the crisis continues. He said capital's in power.
I'm saying I'm having trouble understanding. Are we in a mess or are we not? Okay.
Capitalists are not in a mess.
Well, the capitalists are not the same. If I could be permitted to speak, the problem is not the capitalists; it's their system. You can be wealthy, happy. You can be like the court of Louis XVI just before the Revolution, living it up just before the crash. And the worst thing that we can do if we're going to get into prediction is not to see the problems that they are in. That's the first point. I think Leo's way of placing it allows us better to understand it's crisis prone, and the crisis is due to the internal contradictions amongst the capitalists, not because they don't have a challenger. A thing can fall down, or a thing can get into a mess, even though it has no challenges. So the first thing I want to say is let's not judge the problems the capitalists are in by asking how happy or wealthy they are, or whether they have challenges, but how capable they are of governing and running the world. That's the one second point. I think the method we have to use to judge this is data. And I'm sorry to say that I never thought I would hear myself justifying anything my profession does. But one of the things my fellow economists have told me is that the plural of anecdote is not data. So from Leo, I've heard many examples. But when you look at the macroeconomic data, every single indicator tells us the US economy is in trouble. Export balance, GDP, rate of profit, overcapacity in production, which has declined systematically since 1960. Long-term unemployment. There is not a single indicator, apart from the profits, not the profit rate, but the profits, that shows them doing well. But actually, that isn't a refuge, because if they're sitting on their profits instead of investing them, that is itself what the crisis consists of. The fall of investment, which is the last indicator, is the biggest single cause to the decline in GDP. Capitalism isn't investing. If a capitalist doesn't if capitalism's not investing, it is ceasing to be capitalism. And that's what we have to understand.
You want to take that or Doug?
Well, I just say quickly, it's one thing to say that of the current crisis, and I agree. And in that sense, I think we all agree that this is a long, great crisis of capitalism. It's another thing to say that productivity has been declining since 1950, that there hasn't been investment since 1950, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that is simply otherworldly. Now, one can go through the tea leaves of statistics in order to prove a particular Marxist thesis, and keep readjusting them so that you come up with a set of years and a set of data that justifies the old theory. But I agree, we are now in the type of crisis that both relate to limited investment and underconsumption, and they can't easily find out a way to get out of that. If you want to say at the same time that capitalism has not been dynamic over the last 50 years, if you want to say with the monthly review comrades of mine that it was right in 1950 to say that the only thing that was keeping American capitalism going was the war economy, or indeed waste production, and ignore what has happened the last 55 years, I don't think you're living in the world I'm living in.
Yeah, I would just say capitalism is a crisis-prone system. There's no question about that. But I think a lot of capitalists would say, so what? I mean, it's part of its dynamism. It's a way to make money. Old things die and new things are born, and you have crises that may take years to work themselves out, but they have every other time worked themselves out. I haven't. Maybe this time it won't. But I think Marx said permanent crises do not exist, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. Jim O'Connor once told me that he thinks capitalism has been in crisis since the 13th century. That seems like a rather extreme view. I think it's a system that thrives on crisis, and the political power of the capitalist class is right now unchallenged. Political, ideological, and financial power of the capitalist class now, despite all the troubles they're in and their system is in, is really quite remarkably solid.
Yes.
I just have two things to say. That's in America. America is not the world. Secondly, I would like to say one more thing. The idea that somehow the crisis, the volatile and crisis-prone nature of capitalism is part of its dynamism is not. Unlike what many people have tried to tell us, they've smuggled this in, sort of. It's not a Marxian concept. It's a Schumpeterian concept, and it's very, very important to remember the difference.
Environment?
There is no equal.
Yeah, we'll get that in a second. We'll get one more as well.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was late. I was caught up in Greece. But
So was I.
Which is doing fine.
if the new way of making profit is to manufacture debt, so that people will constantly be paying you without you having to sell them anything more, and you therefore find it expedient to create and reproduce debt in whatever classes, certainly perhaps also the working classes, because they will be more indebted quicker. And if this new style of financialization has indeed lowered the incentive to invest in productive industrial enterprise, and if that's contributing to the crisis, what do we say about the dynamism of the system and its ability to withstand the crisis as it relates to Europe, not to say anywhere else? Won't that bounce back on us in a sort of like a tsunami?
Okay, we also had the earlier question about the environment that's important because it relates to the theme of the conference. So whoever would like to address those.
Maybe one or two others.
I'll get one more, I guess. Sure, this gentleman here.
So, question to Leo. Doug can comment. So I'm starting from the frame that I think the capitalists are doing very well now by all indications, profit rate, the political challenge internally, international, in the United States, in the framework of a crisis which is going on and will continue. I think basically the capitalists are doing very well right now. But here's the question I want to ask to Leo, is that, when you look at the snapshot right now, it seems to me you spend a lot of time arguing against people that want to say that the dollar is about to be dethroned because all the evidence are that it's not being dethroned. And I totally agree, all the evidence is it's not being dethroned. But one thing you don't mention, and partially your comments addressed this before, saying that's out there a little bit, but it seems to me that the shift to the third world of production and the growing share by the third world of value added in the total world production, it seems to me, has to, down the road, really threaten the American dollar. Sort of in a vague sense, the Arrighi sort of idea that if production eventually goes somewhere, finance is going to follow. Finance doesn't actually lead production. Finance in the final, we know it's doing a hell of a lot to mess it up, but in the final analysis, it has to go to where the production is. So don't you see that there is a brewing a problem for the dollar, on this narrow question, from this shift of value added to the third world?
Okay, to take this third one first, perhaps, but we live in a highly integrated capitalist economy. The role of the City of London remains absolutely central in that global economy, despite the long decline of European industry and the British industry even before it.
Partly propped up
Now,
by
this
New York.
partly has to do with, precisely, the uneven and combined development of capitalism. The fact that financial markets, for various reasons that have to go back to pre-capitalist merchant exchange, got rooted in certain types of institutions, certain types of expertise, and certain types of states with the capacity to facilitate and protect that. And then certain types of industrialists who develop relationships with those kinds of finance. So the depth of London and New York as financial markets is very important to the integrated production taking place in the third world. I would say what is certainly the case is that the development of capitalism in the third world, in certain states of the third world,
Right.
heaven knows, the combined and uneven development, even inside these third world developing capitalist states, is enormous. But the rapid proletarianization of so much of the third world is bound, in your long-term type of thinking, to reduce the gap between the advanced capitalist working classes and their standard of living and the proletariats of the third world. That is inevitable. In the ugly ways in which that will occur, we cannot possibly predict. Could it be 50 years from now that the dollar will be displaced? Who the hell knows? All I know is that right now, right, Keynes was wrong about the bank book. You could have a continuing and expanding capitalism with the American dollar at its center. We saw it. It's happened, right? And it can, and insofar as this crisis regenerates the central role of the dollar and the central role of the American state in managing, in superintending that central role, for the time being, that's where things are at. And it means that the Federal Reserve looks progressive because it's taking responsibility, right, for keeping some loose money in the system when there's such fiscal austerity. And the German state looks irresponsible because it doesn't take responsibility for global capitalism in that way. An old story that's always frustrated the Americans. Now, I do think this takes us to the other questions raised, especially the ecological crisis. It is a chaotic system. It's an increasingly irrational system. And we see that more than ever in the context of the ecological crisis. The scramble to become capitalist in parts of the world that have been so systematically underdeveloped and trying to develop through capitalism with all of the inequalities that will produce, but may get them to capitalism of the type we know, can only exacerbate that climate crisis. And why should we complain they did it? After all, look at what we've done to the world, or our capitalist system has done to the world. The chaos is even worse insofar as the only solution the left can come up with, to deal with the climate crisis, the carbon crisis, is using derivative markets deeply rooted in London and New York in order to try to dissuade capital from polluting the climate even further. That is the chaos of the system and that reflects the weakness of the left, right? That we complain, right, when Canada or the United States don't sign on to carbon trading. Understandably, they don't treat it as a serious problem, but what is that solution? Rather than, we need a system of collective democratic economic planning, which will finally address these kinds of questions. I just say the final thing about finance and credit. My friend and comrade Sam Gindin keeps on quoting Doug around the world. Doug once said that Marxists, or some Marxists, think if you drop something on your foot and it doesn't hurt, it doesn't count. A commodity is not only a machine tool. A commodity is not only a refrigerator. A commodity is a colonoscopy. A commodity is the way in which our very DNA is being turned into profitable goods by the biotechnology industry. A commodity is the way in which HMOs are not simply insurance companies, but are investors in colostomy and managers of hospitals, which of course are, in this country, arenas of accumulation. And due to the 18 American health corporations that are the leading health producers in the world, are rapidly trying to turn the rest of the world, including Canadian hospitals, into profit-making accumulators as well.
Well, taking over from government and military is
Yes.
also part of that. And
Yeah.
I can see that. I am a little worried about the reliance on debt.
Yeah,
That's
no, I am
right.
too.
And you're right to be worried
You
about
are-
that.
you're
And
right to
not
be
all
worried.
the debt that's being generated is functional to any kind
Of
of
course.
production, or even, in fact, most of it isn't.
I even agree with that.
Anybody
You're right.
else want to
But they can't live without the others.
Yeah, I have a couple of things to say. I get uncomfortable with people talking about production sort of disappearing, because there's plenty of production going on. We wouldn't have an ecological crisis if there weren't a lot of production going on. As for China, an interesting thing I learned recently is that something like 45% of the value of this thing, even though it's assembled in China, something like 45% of the value actually comes from Japanese components. So the first world is not dead yet. And then finally, on the climate crisis, I think that is just the most profound and terrifying thing I can think of right now. And I'd much rather study charts of the rising CO2 concentration and ocean temperatures. I think that's much more fruitful intellectually than studying the falling rate of profit, which is not a very illuminating graph in my view. No, it's frightening, and the inability of our political system, our economic system to comprehend it, much less cope with it, is a sign of total rot.
Or capital.
Let's get a few more questions. Yeah, sure.
Question primarily for Professor Desai. The Bretton Woods dollar, since you brought up the closing of the gold window, was that a false promise that propped up the U.S. post-war? Has it not been replaced by the control of the shipping lanes that requires that oil must be purchased in dollars, else you suffer the fate of Gaddafi, for example. Also, generally, the debt deflation theory of Irving Fisher as a source of financial instability that is not rooted in production. If the renminbi is not an international currency, wherewith does China purchase oil? What would you have China purchase oil from the Middle East with? Finally, just the meaning of TRPF on sheet.
The falling rate of profit.
Tendency of the rate of profit to fall.
Right. Yeah, my question to the panelists is around a political alternative to change the current conditions of a dominance of capital, which all panelists seem to agree on. In the Occupy movement, there was a group called the Demands Working Group, and they agreed on a broad demand of a mass public works program, open for all immigrants to formerly incarcerated, make the rich pay, and the empire. And it did gain, quite a bit of support, but because of the crazy rules of the way the Occupy operated and the way the anarchists went ballistic over raising demands on the state, it really didn't come to a full debate. But it has been taken up by a group in Newark, New Jersey, where the state that Doug hails from. They had a year-long picket. A number of community and labor groups endorsed it. And now they're taking it a step forward. They're going to have a conference in Rutgers University. It won't be just like the left forum. It won't just be a talk conference, but it'll be about debating some broad demands that the movement could kind of agree on. And then in the afternoon session would be well, the morning session, debating those and then voting on it, what we agree on. And public works will be one of the major demands discussed. And then the afternoon, how we can work around what kind of actions we can take to actually win that. So the question is, get to the question, what do you think about that type of demand and movement of kind of changing the dynamics, the political dynamics? And also, what do you see some of the obstacles? Like in the Occupy movement, we saw the left wing of neoliberalism, the anarchists, were vehemently against putting demands on the state. And then we have this whole layer of NGOs who are all into these little narrow struggles and are not amenable to these broad struggles. So that's
Let's take one more question. Yep.
Just let me mention, I'm an anarchist and I'm for putting
okay. Well, then,
but that wasn't what I wanted to.
I just
But I'm bothered by these kind of dichotomy between the ecological crisis and the economic social crisis, which occurs like the reference to the falling rate of profit that's over here, and over here is a question of the rising CO2 level. I think the tendency towards stagnation is directly connected with the inability of the ruling class to do something about the world crisis. They say that they're doing fine when at the moment the entire globe is going to be, affected, transformed by global warming. They're not doing fine, and it's not a separate system. It's one system, and it's directly connected. Similarly, talking about post-World War II boom, well, part of that was paid for by the mass use of petroleum, turning petroleum from coal and so forth, paid for at a very low, at a cheap level, not counting the future costs of what will be more expensive as it is today, of course, the change to eventual change to alternate forms of energy and so forth. These things are all interconnected, and it's one vast crisis. It's not okay in one area, but it's about to crash in the other area, and I think that ought to be talked about.
Okay, Radhika, just.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So first of all, on the ecological crisis, I just want to say that I think that in many ways, although often we are being told that in the 50s and 60s in particular, the ecological crisis or ecological aspects of capitalism were a lot worse. I would say that they were a lot worse, in fact, under neoliberalism. And I think that's all. Otherwise, I agree with you that we are in the midst of a serious ecological crisis. I also think that you can't really, I think that the wherewithal to address it is already in place in many ways, in the sense that we already live in a highly regulated form of capitalism. And I think that in order to address it, what we have to do is to basically require the state to require capitalists or whoever else is running, because I don't assume that only capitalists will be running production centers, but in a different way. So I think that it can be managed, and I think it can also be managed by increasing common amenities. There are a whole range of things that we can do about them, and we can start now. It's not that we are going to wait for some revolution that's going to come in one loud thunderclap. It can be done now. I just want to say one thing, which is that this idea, Leo said that the dollar has never been stronger. I think even those, I'm thinking of, say, people like Barry Eichengreen, who have studied this in great detail, when they argue that the dollar is not going anywhere any fast, perhaps not for the next 50 years or whatever, even they don't say that. They show statistics that demonstrate that its role in international transactions is decreasing, that its share of world reserves is decreasing. All of these things are fact. On top of that, what they don't say is that increasingly the dollar, which has continuously declined in value since 1973, as well as since 2008, barring dips here, upticks here and there, and we can discuss, there were two in particular that were very important. Basically, it has been declining in value. People have been trying, countries have been trying to find their way away from the dollar through bilateral agreements to trade between two countries, to trade in each other's currency, multilateral agreements to pool their reserves, and a whole load. And the BRICS are coming up with a development bank. a contingency reserve agreement, all of these sorts of things. And of course, very interestingly as well, gold has been, of course, going up in price. Although it has recently declined, it still remains very high. At the moment, again, there are all these jitters about where the dollar is going to go, given that the stock market bubble, which is entirely the creation of QE, is being endangered. So I think that, let's not assume, because these things can happen overnight. It may look to you like, oh, well, certainly nothing is going to happen for 50 years. I think it's already, its scope is shrinking, and it can, you can have a big dollar crisis pretty soon. Keynes was not wrong. If you want to show that Keynes was wrong about the dollar crisis, you have to show why the Triffin dilemma did not, how the Triffin dilemma did not apply, because it continued to apply to the dollar and continues to apply to this day. You have to show exactly what is the way in which liquidity can be provided in a stable fashion to the rest of the world without capital exports, because and how a country like the US can export capital, Britain could only do it because of its control over a whole range of colonies. There was one other, yes, China. How will China, I mean, you're right, of course, that in the 1970s, the rise in the price of oil, and since then, in fact, has sort of put a floor under the dollar. Of course, it has not prevented the dollar from continuing to decline. It has not prevented the United States from being extremely concerned about any suggestion that some country or another, major oil exporters, might start denominating their currency, their oil in some other currency. China is increasingly coming to agreements with oil exporting countries to buy their oil in some other currency as well. I think, and as are other countries. I mean, I think that it's not just China. And you were saying that what would China pay the rest of the world with? I think that the Chinese, the governor of the People's Bank of China has already went on record within months of the 2008 financial crisis to point out that the world needed a super sovereign currency. A super sovereign currency would be a currency of no country in the world, and there could be common rules about its management and common rules about its value and how it would be determined. And there are a variety of ways of doing this, some of which, some people continue to explore this. So I think that, and of course people point out that in order to arrive at that, we would need such a lot of political agreement that it's not going to happen. This is true, of course, and as long as the West can, and in fact the United States has, how can you say, scuppered attempts to do this for a very long time. But I think we have now come to a point in history where if the United States is not willing to play ball, if it's going to basically say, well, if I cannot be number one, then I'm not playing, fine, other countries are going to start games of their own. And as Al pointed out, as their economic weight rises in the world, they will stop using the dollar, and you know what will happen then? All these fantastic and beautiful derivatives and whatever shit is going to affect only the Americans. And when that happens, the Americans will say, all right, we want a public utility banking system, and more power to it.
Right, the gentleman here asked about political demands and running insurance. I don't know if anybody wanted to end this.
Oh, well, I mentioned green Keynesianism in my opening remarks. I know that's tedious and moderate of me, but, I think there is an aspect with Keynes, of reviving Keynes's rather enigmatic and suggestive remark about the somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment. I mean, so it's not, the end of capitalism, but it does involve stepping on capitalist toes and setting investment priorities. And the state is going to have to do that. There is absolutely no substitute for that. Like I said, I think the climate crisis is just the most profound thing facing humanity, and it's going to take an active state to turn that around. And it's going to take an active state really bending what capitalists do and doing things on its own. And I think that's an extremely important demand to make. And you can create jobs, all those good things, as well as actually perhaps extending the lifespan of humans on Earth.
Anybody else in the political side?
I certainly think that one should be centering our demands around direct, massive public employment. And insofar as that would be building infrastructure, all the more stuff. The question is, what are the consequences of doing that? What are the contradictions that would lead to? We should be aware of about public employment, of course, will be undertaken and involve funding private construction.
No. Well, the demand was from,
Well, that would be good.
direct government employment.
That should be made clear.
that
No,
was
but direct
clear.
government, yeah, that should be made clear.
Yeah, that was-
So, that's very important.
Yeah.
However, states have, if they had any capacity to build the TVA without employing private contractors, which they didn't even then, would have to develop the capacity to do so. In other words, the direct public employment in the building of infrastructure in such a deeply implanted capitalist system, you have to understand the implications that has in terms of involving capitalists in that process. Not only in production, but also in the finance of it. One of the reasons they're reluctant to do it, of course, does have to do with what bond markets get worried about. It's not whether there are deficits, but whether you've got the money that you've set aside is primarily there to pay interest to bondholders, or whether it's there to provide direct employment, salaries to workers, welfare recipients, etc. All I'm trying to get at is that this is a class struggle, and I totally agree with you. And therefore, we need to think about what are the conditions for seeing this through. I was actually hoping that after Obama's re-election, he would put heavy pressure on Wall Street to get the fucking Republicans off his back in order to do exactly the kind of Rooseveltian public spending that would get this economy going. And heaven knows, 75% of mainstream economists are calling for this kind of thing. That he hasn't done so, that he hasn't even tried to get Wall Street to get the Republicans off his back. It's not that this didn't happen in the past. In order to get Bretton Woods through, the Treasury had to put enormous pressure on Wall Street to get the Republican congressmen off their backs in 1944 to let Bretton Woods be passed. And they did. And they put very heavy pressure on them, and they gave up concessions to them. The political conditions don't appear to be here for this. In terms of building a left, I think you want to make that demand. You want to make it as strongly as possible, but you want to link it to what Doug and Renica were both talking about. You want to link it to the likelihood of this only being achieved insofar as the financial system in this country is turned into a public utility, which isn't only a technical thing, it's about taking power away from a crucial element of the capitalist class. That's how you build consciousness, that's how you build a movement. When you actually get into the state and try to introduce such policies, then you see how far you get, which is what we were talking about with Syriza. But in order to build consciousness, you want to link it, I think, to finance and its power and its centrality in American capitalism.
All right, we're out of time. Thanks for